Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Make Politics Boring Again. I'm going to be changing the format of this podcast going forward, so it's going to be more of a question and answer format, like an agony aunt for politics, basically. So for example, if you're trying to understand an issue that's in the news, or you don't understand a politics or economics concept, then you can feel free to send it to me and I'll try to answer it for you. You can get in touch either through Instagram at MakePoliticsBoringAgain or through my website at makepoliticsboringagain.co.uk or email me directly at rob@makepoliticsboringagain.co.uk. So let's get started with our first question.
How can countries in the global south resist exploitation by corporations?
This is a broad question and I could do an entire podcast episode on this alone, but there are two methods that I'm particularly interested in: de-dollarization and joining the BRICS economic bloc. De-dollarization is critical because it means becoming less dependent on the American dollar when it comes to international trade and finance. So many countries in the global south are quite vulnerable economically because of the dollar's dominance. So by doing their global trade in a different currency, such as the Chinese yen, cuts America out of the process completely. So they won't have oversight over the deal because the money won't be passing through an American bank account, and that way America won't be receiving banking fees either. Countries in the global south should also be looking to reduce their reliance on Western-controlled financial systems like the SWIFT mechanism in order to gain more economic independence. I'll talk more about the BRICS economic bloc in a moment, but some countries within that bloc specifically have actually already moved towards de-dollarization by starting to establish a common currency for trade and investment and creating their own bank as well. This shift away from the dollar allows these countries to conduct their transactions in local currencies or alternative currencies, which will then strengthen the ties between those individual countries and reduce the amount of leverage that multinational corporations and Western financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank hold over them when it comes to trade negotiations and debt refinancing. So my second idea for countries to avoid exploitation by corporations is by expanding the BRICS economic bloc. If you've listened to any of my previous episodes, you'll have heard me talk about the BRICS economic bloc before. So it's a bloc that's made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, among other smaller countries. And it's mainly focused on improving economic cooperation amongst countries in the East and the global South. As these countries work closer together and develop stronger relationships, they can develop their economies and negotiate better terms with these multinational corporations in order to get out from under the boot of the West. For example, the new development bank that's been created by the BRICS bloc has provided the member countries with an alternative source of funding for infrastructure development projects. So this enables them to bypass the traditional Western-dominated institutions like the IMF or the World Bank, which tend to impose exploitative conditions, such as insisting on free market policies and austerity measures, in order to get any kind of funding or loan from them. As these countries gain more power in the negotiations, they can also place stronger regulations on the corporations, especially when it comes to extracting the country's resources, so fewer profits go into the pockets of wealthy nations and can instead be used to develop those countries in the global south. So de-dollarization and expanding the BRICS bloc are just two of a variety of ways for developing countries in the global south to limit the amount of exploitation by multinational corporations.
How should the UK address the legacy of its colonial past?
This is a really complex topic with various areas that need addressing because the British Empire stretched around the world. So any policies need to address our colonial past in the UK and abroad. So obviously reparations would be an obvious first step, but we need to go beyond financial compensation. We need to invest in tackling the structural inequalities within the UK itself, because marginalised communities from former colonies continue to face systemic disadvantages in areas like housing, education, and employment, and they were also proven to be disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Now, diversity, equality, and inclusion quotas for companies are a really good start, and more university grants for students from minority communities would really help to level the playing field. But housing also needs to be tightly regulated too, through things like rent caps and ensuring that suitable accommodation is provided and kept in a livable condition by landlords. In relation to education, I believe that much more needs to be done to educate the public about the realities of the British Empire, because the narrative being taught in schools tends to focus on glorifying the empire while ignoring the immense damage it caused. As Churchill himself said, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And coincidentally, Churchill would actually be a large part of this education, as there needs to be a balanced and honest account of his role in Britain's imperialism. Public institutions like museums and government bodies should be engaging in this process of educating the public by providing transparent and accessible accounts of the UK's colonial past. Talking of museums, I also believe that more needs to be done to repatriate the cultural artefacts that we stole from other countries. And if it's not possible to return these artefacts to the countries where they belong, either because the country doesn't have the facilities to look after the artefacts and they don't want them to be damaged, or maybe the country's politically unstable, then agreements should be made that are financially beneficial for all parties, because these objects hold deep cultural, spiritual, and national significance. So this would go some way to healing relationships with previous colonies, and the profits from tourism could be used to develop those countries, many of which are in the global south. This brings me to my next point, about increasing the amount of aid we provide to the Commonwealth and other countries that we have previously oppressed. But this aid can't be paternalistic or exploitative like the loans from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF that I previously mentioned, who require the countries that they loan money to then install austerity measures that stunt the country's growth and keep it in a cycle of poverty. The aid needs to empower these countries to achieve sustainable development on their own terms and to help them to move more towards green technology in order to compensate for the effects of climate change that have largely been caused by the West. This leads me to my final point, which is about debt relief and using our voting power to advocate for the interests of developing countries across the global south. Many of these countries are trapped in cycles of debt that have their roots in colonial era policies, and I believe that the UK should be a leader in efforts to minimise or cancel these debts entirely, which would then free those countries from financial systems that keep them dependent and impoverished. We need to remember that we have a considerable amount of power and influence over international institutions like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. So we should be using this influence to advocate for the interests of developing countries and to push for reforms that create fairer structures around trade, finance, and governance. So, to answer this question, there are many ways in which the UK can address its colonial past, and the points I've mentioned need to be high up on our list of priorities if we are going to make any progress in this area.
Is the current structure of the United Nations outdated? How could it be reformed to better represent the global south?
Yes, I believe it is definitely outdated. So the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council within the United Nations, and they got this status based on the power dynamics of 1945. But the world has moved on since then, and the Global South now represents the majority of the world's population and is disproportionately affected by climate change, inequality, and conflict. So they deserve much more of a voice in the UN and the Security Council. The biggest crime here is that Africa, an entire continent containing 54 countries, has no permanent representation on the Security Council, despite being one of the main topics of debate within the UN. India and Brazil have also been left out of any decision-making roles, despite being huge economic and regional powers. The first thing I would do is to make the UN more democratic and more internationally minded by adding permanent seats in the Security Council for countries like Brazil, India, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia, while also abolishing the veto power of the Permanent Five so that no single nation can unilaterally block progress. This would of course be strongly resisted by the permanent members, so the veto could be limited to just cases involving violations of international law or genocide. I do recognise that expanding the number of permanent members could make the Security Council less efficient and more prone to gridlock, especially on key issues like military interventions or climate actions. But these issues can be overcome, and it starts with giving developing countries a seat at the top table so they can have greater control over their own destinies. The funding of the UN also needs to be addressed because right now it's mostly funded by the US, China, Japan, Germany, and the UK, and the US alone supplies 22% of the total budget, which means that the UN's priorities are often skewed towards the interests of the wealthiest nations. So reforming this system needs to include fairer contributions, which could then reduce dependency on its donors. One solution, for example, would actually be to tie funding contributions to a combination of GDP, historical carbon emissions, and colonial legacies. Obviously, this is much, much easier said than done, but it would be a step in the right direction. I would also give the General Assembly more power, as every member state has an equal vote regardless of their size or their power or economic status, which makes it the most democratic body within the UN. But right now, its role is largely as an advisor because the General Assembly's resolutions are non-binding, which makes it a relatively weak counterbalance to the power of the Security Council, where the decisions, like I said before, are dominated by the interests of the permanent 5 members. So when it comes to resolutions by the General Assembly on global issues like climate change, international security, or trade deals, I would give these resolutions more power by making them legally binding if passed by a supermajority. So, for example, if they're passed by 2/3 of the member states. If an agreement still isn't reached by a supermajority, then it could go to a second vote on for example, the two leading options maybe. Or it could go straight to the Security Council, who get the final vote. In addition to that, I would give the General Assembly more influence in setting the UN's priorities in areas like development, debt relief, and climate justice, which are critical areas for the Global South. We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, I'll be answering the final two questions of this episode. And don't forget that you can get in contact directly through Instagram at Make Politics Boring Again, or through the website makepoliticsboringagain.co.uk.
Please hold and we'll answer your call as soon as possible.
Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again.
How should the global community respond to the rise of right-wing authoritarianism in countries like Brazil or India?
First and foremost, I believe that the issue should be dealt with internally if possible. But that's not to say that democratic nations can't fund civil society organisations, for example, or independent media groups and grassroots movements within these countries. If further measures are needed, then governments should create targeted economic measures against authoritarian leaders. These measures could take the form of travel bans and asset freezes on officials responsible for any human rights abuses, or if they're participants in the deterioration of their democracy. It would also help to tie trade agreements or foreign investment to measurable commitments on human rights and press freedom, as well as environmental protections. More severe measures can be taken if needed, such as threatening to place heavy trade tariffs on authoritarian countries, but making sure to target them in a way that avoids unintentionally harming ordinary citizens, which could then further exacerbate the nationalist atmosphere. Platforms like the United Nations Human Rights Council can also be used to investigate human rights abuses, and coalitions like the G7 can be used to advocate for the installation of democracy in these authoritarian countries, provided that these coalitions are also built on a democratic basis, which ties in with the previous question on how the structure of the UN can be improved. It's worth noting that right-wing authoritarianism rarely occurs within a vacuum. It can be caused by economic inequality and disillusionment with democracy, especially in countries that are stuck in a cycle of poverty because of colonial debts, like structural adjustment programs, which have been applied by the IMF in the past. I've mentioned this already in this episode, but it's worth mentioning again. These programs by the IMF require the enforcement of austerity measures like privatization and spending cuts, which have then exacerbated inequality and prevented any democratic development. So these debts need to be proportional and applied appropriately, and they should also be removed when appropriate. Direct diplomacy is also crucial. Communication lines need to be kept open at all times, so the country in question doesn't become entirely isolated from the international community and spiral into civil war and potentially bankruptcy.
What does a genuinely decolonised approach to international trade and aid look like, and how could it be implemented?
I would say that the focus needs to be on fairness, empowerment, and reparations in order to address the inequalities caused by colonialism and neo-colonial systems. For trade, this requires fair agreements that benefit both sides equally, and removing unfair tariffs, especially with countries in the global south, in order to help them move beyond exporting raw materials by supporting local industries. Wealthier nations should also share their technology and expertise to help these countries develop their own economies. Regarding aid, support should be provided without harmful conditions like forced privatization, so that communities can decide for themselves how this aid is used. This is exactly how a charity called Give Directly operates, and it's one that I donate to because they give these donations to communities and individuals and allow them to decide how the money is best spent. So whether it's on buying immediate resources that they desperately need, or investing in their business or setting up a new business. And I just really believe that that is the best way that we can provide aid to these countries. And we need to prioritize funding for basic necessities like healthcare, education, and more sustainable agriculture. We need to remember as well that wealthy countries in the West have a responsibility to help developing countries to adapt to the effects of climate change and to find ways to mitigate these effects. As I've said before, debt relief is also essential because many countries remain trapped in poverty due to colonial era debts and high interest rates, while the free market policies forced on those countries prevent it from ever getting out of debt. As I've already mentioned, institutions like the UN, the World Trade Organization, and the IMF need to be reformed in order to ensure fair representation and to encourage partnerships between developing nations so that they can reduce their reliance on wealthier countries and to also challenge the dominance of Western-led financial systems, which is exactly why partnerships like the BRICS economic bloc are so important. Ultimately, a decolonization approach to trade and aid would empower nations in the global south to build self-sufficient economies and break free from cycles of dependency in order to participate in a truly equitable global system. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for in this week's episode, but feel free to send in your own questions for me to answer on next week's episode. You can get in contact through Instagram at MakePoliticsBoringAgain or through the website at makepoliticsboringagain.co.uk, and you can submit your questions through the contact form on the site. Thanks so much for listening. Make sure to subscribe and to give us a review. It's always really appreciated. In the meantime, look after yourselves, and I'll see you next week.
Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make